Calder Hayes hadn't felt anything but grief for 3 long years, until the morning a wounded husky and her tiny pup stepped out of the snow and stood silently at his cabin door. He thought he'd escaped the world, but in that single moment, the mountains handed him a reason to live again. Snow came heavy to Snowpine Ridge, the way it always did when winter had decided it was done being polite and ready to see what a man was made of. Thick, white flakes drifted down through the dark spruce, burying old tracks, swallowing sound, turning the Montana high country into a world of muted light and cold breath. The mountains out here weren't the kind that cared whether you were ready or not. They just rose, blue and unforgiving, along the spine of the horizon. And if you chose to live beneath them, that was your business. Calder Hayes had made that choice 3 years ago, and never once pretended it was about anything but escape. At 41, he carried his years the way he carried his pack, like extra weight he'd gotten used to but never quite forgot about. His beard had gone from dark brown to a storm-touched mix of black and ash, framing a face lined deeper on the left side where the wind hit hardest on the ridge. His eyes were a steady gray, the color of snow clouds that had already made up their mind, and there was a permanent set to his jaw that said he'd run out of things to argue with a long time ago. He wore the same gear almost every day, a battered brown canvas jacket gone shiny at the elbows, a faded flannel shirt, denim worn white at the knees, and boots that had seen more miles of elk trail than most trucks saw highway. The hat was the only indulgence, broad-brimmed felt in dark coffee brown, a gift from his father long before life had narrowed down to a cabin, a valley, and a silence he didn't trust anyone else to understand. The cabin itself sat back from the old logging road on a little shoulder of land above the creek, a log and chink relic his father had bought for a song in the 80s when nobody wanted mountain land that far from town. Calder had patched the roof, replaced the stove, and left almost everything else the way it was the day he'd driven up after the funeral in Missoula, and never really gone back. Inside, one whole wall was shelves, his father's field guides, old maps, and the few books Calder had grabbed from the house he and Ellie had shared. On a nail above the table hung a single framed photograph in a cheap wooden frame. Ellie Grant, standing in front of a trailhead sign, dark hair stuffed under a knit cap, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes laughing at something he'd said just out of frame. She'd been a backcountry guide, sharp and fearless, and so alive that the idea of her not moving somewhere in the world still didn't sit right in his bones. The avalanche had taken her on a March afternoon that had started out clear and bright, the kind of blue sky day you warned clients about because it made them forget how quickly snow could turn mean. Calder had replayed those minutes more times than there were trees in the valley. The crack, the white roar, the way his voice had vanished under it. And no matter how he rearranged the memory, it always ended with him digging and shouting her name into a silence that never answered. After that, there'd been nothing in town that didn't hurt to look at. So he'd sold what he could, left the rest in storage, and driven until the pavement ran out. Up here, the only things that remembered Ellie were the scars on his hands from digging, and that photograph watching him from the wall. On the morning everything changed, he woke before dawn to the sound of the stove ticking low and the faint hiss of wind probing the gaps around the window frames. He lay there a moment, listening to the old cabin settle, to the way the valley breathed under all that snow. Outside, the world was still ink dark, but he knew the ridgeline by feel now, could picture how the pines would be bent under the weight, how the creek would be running black between collars of ice. He swung his legs out of bed, shrugged into his jacket, and laced his boots by lantern light. Every movement practiced. There was rabbit line to check, snares along the lower rim of the timber, and if he was lucky, there'd be enough meat to stretch his supplies another week. He stepped out onto the small porch, breath feathering in the pre-dawn cold, and pulled the door shut behind him, not bothering to latch it. No one came up here, and the few things worth stealing were memories nobody else wanted. Snow came up almost to the tops of his boots as he dropped off the porch and cut across the clearing, the cabin behind him a dark block of shadow against the paler snow. The forest took him in the way it always did, branches catching his sleeves, the smell of pine and cold earth steadying his mind. He moved through it like a man who had once known how to move fast and now preferred to set his own pace. As he walked, his thoughts drifted the way they always drifted when he was alone long enough. Back to Ellie. To the way she'd grab his arm and point when she spotted a distant elk on a ridgeline. To the way she'd say his name when she was half asleep, voice rough with dreams. He told himself those memories were like the old tracks the snow was burying, still there underneath but fading, softer, less likely to trip him up if he wasn't watching. It wasn't true, but it was a story he could live with. The snares were mostly empty that morning, the rabbits either too smart or too lucky, and by the time Calder started back up toward the cabin, his mood had sunk to match the leaden sky. The snow had thickened into a steady curtain, blurring the trees at the edge of the clearing. The wind had picked up, too, sending little waves of powder skittering over the drifts. He hunched his shoulders, adjusted the strap of his half-empty pack, and made for home, boots creaking in the cold. From a distance, the cabin looked exactly the way it always did on a bad weather day. Smoke barely drifting from the stovepipe, porch half buried, door a rough rectangle of darker wood. It wasn't until he got within 20 yards that he realized he wasn't alone. At first, he thought the shape by the porch was just another shadow, a trick of the flat gray light. Then it moved, a shift of weight, a lift of the head, and he stopped dead where he was. Standing at the base of the cabin steps, half-turned toward the door, was a dog. Not just any dog, but a husky, tall and lean under the thick coat, silver gray and white like snow under moonlight. She was soaked in places where the snow had melted into her fur, and her ribs showed faintly under all that thickness, like she'd missed too many good meals. Her eyes were the thing that pinned him in place, though, ice blue, sharp, taking his measure the way a wary rider looked over a stranger at a saloon door. Beside her, halfway up the first step, sat a pup that looked like a smaller echo of her. Same blue eyes, same mask of gray over white, fur puffed out with cold and fear and something like stubbornness. The little one's paws were splayed in the snow, and it shivered, but it didn't back away. Between them, on the step, lay a small bundle of worn canvas and straps, the kind of makeshift pack you sometimes saw city folks put on their dogs when they wanted them to carry their own treats on a trail. On this pup, it looked both ridiculous and heartbreakingly earnest. Calder's first instinct was caution. A dog out here could mean people, and people meant questions he didn't want to answer. His hand went automatically to the knife at his belt, fingers resting on the worn handle, though he knew steel wouldn't do him much good if this turned bad. A desperate animal went for the throat faster than a man could think. But the husky didn't lunge. She didn't growl. She just shifted her weight so she was square to him, placing herself between the pup and this stranger in the snow, and watched him with an intensity that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. There was fear there, sure, but something else layered over it, something that looked an awful lot like hope. It hit him harder than it should have. Maybe it was the way the snow clung to her whiskers, the way her sides rose and fell a little too fast, or maybe it was just that particular shade of blue in her eyes. But for one surreal heartbeat, Calder could have sworn he was looking at Ellie the last winter they'd had together, standing in the doorway of their rental in town, asking him if he was ever going to stop trying to carry the whole damn mountain on his shoulders. She'd had that same mix of caution and challenge in her gaze, that same "don't you dare look away from me" determination. He swallowed, fingers loosening on the knife. "Where'd you come from, girl?" His voice sounded rough in the stillness, like he hadn't used it in days. Maybe he hadn't. The husky flicked one ear but didn't move. Snow gathered along her spine, her paws half buried. The pup sneezed, a tiny sound in the large quiet, and lifted one paw as if the cold bit a little too deep. Calder saw the way. The mother dog's muscles tightened at that, the way her head dipped toward the little one as if reassuring without taking her eyes off him for a second. He noticed other things, too, now that he was closer. A band of missing fur around her neck just above the chest, where the coat should have been thickest. The skin there was puckered and rough, a ring of old scarring that looked like something had rubbed and cut and burned over and over until the body healed around it. A collar, he thought. Not the soft kind folks bought at feed stores either. Something heavier, something that shouldn't have been on a dog left to wander the backside of Snowpine Ridge in midwinter. "Somebody used you hard," he murmured, more to himself than to her. The words steamed in the air between them and vanished. The husky blinked once, slow, and for a second he had the unnerving sense she'd understood. The wind cut across the clearing then, sharper, carrying with it the edge of a coming blow. Calder's practical side snapped back online. Whatever story had put these two here could wait. Right now, if he didn't move, they were all going to be in trouble. He took one careful step forward, then another, keeping his posture loose, hands visible. "Easy," he said quietly. "I'm not looking for a fight." The pup shifted, and the little canvas bundle on its back slid sideways, the buckle catching on the step. There was a soft tearing sound as one of the old leather straps finally gave up, and the whole thing tumbled off onto the snow with a dull thump. Something small and metallic clinked as it landed. The husky's head whipped toward the sound, then back to Calder, torn between guarding it and guarding the pup. Calder stopped where he was, lowering himself slowly into a crouch so he wasn't towering over them. From this angle, he could see the tremor in the mother's legs, the exhaustion in the way she held herself upright through sheer will. She'd come a long way on that bad neck and whatever else life had thrown at her, and she was out of reserves. He knew the look. He'd seen it in the mirror enough times. "You're done running," he said softly. "I get it." He reached out a gloved hand, not toward her face, but toward the pup, letting the little one decide. The smaller husky leaned forward on instinct, nose working furiously. For a moment, all he felt was the warm gust of its breath on his fingers, the tickle of whiskers. Then a tiny pink tongue flicked out and touched the leather of his glove. Behind it, the mother's posture changed, just slightly. A minute easing of tension in the shoulders, a fraction of an inch less weight on her front paws. It was enough. Calder let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, and in that same motion, made a decision he would have laughed at 6 months ago. "All right," he said, more to Ellie's picture on the wall inside than to anyone standing in the snow. "Come on in." Then he stood, stepped backward up onto the porch, and swung the cabin door wider, the warm rush of wood smoke and old coffee drifting out into the cold. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a mother husky moved, nudging the pup toward the open doorway with her muzzle, taking the first step out of the deep snow and onto the rough wood planks like someone crossing a threshold they weren't entirely sure they were allowed to use. As she passed him, close enough that he could see the individual ice crystals caught in her fur, Calder's gaze dropped to the little bundle that had fallen from the pup's back. Half buried in powder, something glinted, a worn metal tag attached to a faded strip of leather, the kind of thing people engraved when they believed their animals would always come home. He stooped, brushed the snow away and turned it over in his palm. The letters were faint, edges softened with time and wear, but they were still there, unmistakable. E.G. His heart gave a hard, painful jolt, like it had slammed into a wall. Ellie Grant. There were other names that could fit those initials, he told himself. Other people, other dogs. The world was bigger than his grief. But standing there on that porch, snow falling thick and silent around him, watching a scarred husky mother and her brave little shadow step into the cabin that had been his self-imposed exile, it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like the mountains had just laid a card on the table and were waiting to see if he'd recognize it. Inside, the cabin was dim, lit only by the dull orange of the stove and the gray light leaking through the frosted window. The husky pup stumbled in first, nails clicking on the wooden floor, nose pressed low, drinking in every new scent. The mother came after, moving with a stiff dignity that tried to hide how desperately tired she was. Calder followed, kicking the door shut behind them to keep the wind out. The moment the latch clicked, the mother husky halted. Her head lifted, ears pricking forward, eyes fixed on the far wall. Calder's gaze tracked with hers and landed on the same thing. The photograph of Ellie above the table, the glass catching a sliver of light, throwing a dull gleam across her smiling face. The dog took 3 slow steps toward it, as if drawn by something she didn't quite understand, then stopped directly beneath the frame and sat. For a long, breathless second, cabin and man and animals all seemed to fall into the same stillness. Then the husky tipped her head back just enough that her throat stretched under the old scar tissue and let out a sound that wasn't quite a whine and wasn't quite a howl, thin and aching and full of something that felt too big for the small room to hold. It raised the hairs on Calder's arms, slid under his ribs, and lodged somewhere behind his sternum where the word Ellie lived. The pup pressed against its mother's side, eyes wide, but didn't make a sound. Calder stood. There, fingers clenched around the little tag marked E.G., and for the first time since the avalanche he had the sensation that he wasn't entirely alone in his grief, that something, somehow, had found its way through the snow and the years and the stubborn walls he'd built to lay a gentle hand on the same old wound. He didn't know what story sat behind the scar on that dog's neck, or how a collar with Ellie's initials had ended up strapped to a half-grown husky on his porch, but he knew one thing with the kind of bone-deep certainty you didn't argue with. They were staying. At least for tonight. Maybe longer. "You can sleep here," he said quietly, more vow than invitation, as the mother dog's strange, lonely sound faded into the crackle of the stove. "Both of you." The mountains outside pressed close against the cabin walls, listening, and somewhere in the humming quiet between snowflake and flame, something shifted, subtle as a breath, fragile as hope, but real enough that Calder felt it like a hand at his back, nudging him one step closer to a future he hadn't planned on having. Calder woke before dawn to the soft, uneven rhythm of paws shifting on the wooden planks of the cabin floor, a sound that threaded into his sleep and tugged him slowly back to waking. The stove still glowed with a tired orange pulse, and in that dim hush between night and morning, he could make out the silhouettes of the mother husky and her pup nestled close to the warmth. The pup lay curled against her flank, breathing deep and steady, but the mother stared toward the far wall where Ellie's photograph hung, as if the night had not given her the answers she sought. Calder sat up, joints stiff from the cold and from years of sleeping like a man who expected something to find him. The metal tag lay on the shelf beside him where he'd set it the night before, its edges worn smooth by time and friction. E.G., a pair of letters that should not have survived the storm of his life, much less found their way onto the back of a stray pup's torn canvas pack. The mountains didn't deal in coincidences. He knew that as surely as he knew how the creek froze from the edges inward every winter. But meaning was something harder to hold. Still, after watching the mother dog's strange reaction to Ellie's picture, he couldn't just leave the puzzle sitting unsolved inside these walls. As he stepped into his boots, the mother husky rose and followed him with her eyes. There was less fear there now, though not less caution. Her pup scrambled to its feet, tumbling once on clumsy legs before standing proud, its tail lifting like a flag too big for its small body. Calder crouched, gave the pup a gentle scratch behind the ears and murmured, "I'll be back before the snow climbs much higher." When he stood to grab his coat, the pup whined and nosed at his leg, the tiny sound unexpectedly sharp in his chest. The mother stepped forward, nudging the pup back with a steadying push of her muzzle. Calder didn't miss the protective determination in her posture, nor the flicker of something else, something like trust, faint but present. He slung his pack over his shoulder, stepped out into the brittle morning, and latched the door with a firmness meant to reassure them as much as himself. The world outside was white and unbroken, clouds hanging low over Snowpine Ridge as if weighing their own secrets. Calder followed the trail down toward the old service road, a path he'd traveled countless times alone, but that felt strangely different now. The metal tag rested in his pocket, its weight too meaningful to ignore. Marlene Grant lived 12 miles northwest in the small settlement of Warden's Bluff, 8 if you cut across the frozen flats and trusted the ice. Calder took the longer route. He wasn't afraid of drowning. He was afraid of leaving the mother dog and her pup to wonder why he hadn't returned. As he walked, he let his thoughts drift to Marlene. Ellie's older sister had always been the steadier of the two, shorter than Ellie, with auburn hair chopped blunt just above her shoulders, eyes a steely brown that missed little, and a way of speaking that reminded Calder of the crack of kindling splitting. She had once worked as a veterinary assistant before taking over her late husband's supply shop in town. If anyone recognized the initials or had answers about the dogs, it would be her. By the time the sun pushed weakly through the clouds, Calder reached the cluster of cabins and low buildings that made up Warden's Bluff. Smoke rose from chimneys, the smell of pine and bacon mingled in the air, and the world felt momentarily less empty. He found Marlene outside her shop, hacking ice from the steps with a short-handled axe. She paused when she saw him, leaning on the axe handle while her breath fogged the air between them. "You look like hell, Hayes," she said, though not unkindly. "Guess the mountains didn't get tired of you yet." Calder managed a thin smile. "Morning, Marlene." She studied him with the perceptiveness he remembered, the kind that made dishonesty pointless. "You didn't come down here just for coffee and conversation." "No." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the metal tag. When he held it out, Marlene's expression snapped from curiosity to something stark and grieving, as if a bruise long faded had been pressed without warning. She took it reluctantly, her fingers brushing the worn engraving. "Where did you get this?" Calder told her. Not everything, not the tightening in his chest when he saw the husky mother's blue eyes, not the way Ellie's picture had gleamed in the firelight, but enough. Enough that when he finished, Marlene closed her eyes and exhaled a breath that looked like surrender. "Ellie found them," she said softly. "A whole group of them, half-starved, chained outside a rundown breeder's place south of here. Sheriff shut the place down a week later, but Ellie, she didn't wait for permission. She took the worst of them into her care before the storm came." Calder stood still, letting the words find their place in him. "I didn't know." "She didn't tell you," Marlene said gently, "because she knew you had enough to worry about with your guiding work. She always said you carried more weight than one man should." Marlene turned the tag over in her hand. This one? She called her Willow. Smart girl, fast, too. Ellie said she had eyes like winter water. Calder felt something twist inside him, sharp and unexpectedly fierce. Willow, he echoed. That her name? It was. Marlene's gaze drifted toward the mountains, as if looking for a ghost. Willow disappeared 2 days before the avalanche. Ellie thought she'd slipped out through a gap in the fence. They'd had early winds that week. She handed the tag back with a hand that shook once before steadying. She wanted you to take care of them, you know. Said you'd understand them better than you understood yourself. Calder swallowed against the tightness in his throat. Marlene watched him another moment, then, in the way women sometimes did when they sensed a man caught between memory and obligation, she reached out and touched his arm briefly. She loved you, Hayes, but she didn't want you staying frozen with her. He nodded once, unable to do more. After leaving Marlene's shop, he headed back toward Snow Pine Ridge, the wind picking up at his back. About halfway home, he noticed snow drifting sideways, an omen he recognized too well. The sky dimmed under a thickening shroud of clouds, and the treetops began rattling like bones shaken in a cup. A storm was brewing, fast and mean. By the time Calder reached the cabin clearing, snow was whipping in agonizing spirals, stinging his face. He pushed through it, calling out instinctively, though he knew the wind would swallow his voice. The pup barreled out from under the porch with a yelp of relief, bounding toward him with snow flying from its paws. But the mother wasn't with it. Calder's stomach dropped. The pup darted toward the tree line, then back to him, whining anxiously. Calder followed its gaze and saw tracks leading toward the creek. Panic surged through him, cold and sharp. He sprinted, boots slipping, snow blinding him, heart hammering in a way he hadn't felt since the day he lost Ellie. The creek was a thin scar of black water between white banks, half frozen. Willow stood at the edge, one paw stuck between ice slabs, her body trembling as she fought not to slip into deeper water. Calder didn't hesitate. He plunged forward, crashing through the snow, calling her name, her real name, for the first time. Willow! Hold on! The wind carried the words away, but she lifted her head, eyes locking on his with a plea that landed like a blow. He reached her, dropped to his knees, and wedged his arms beneath her chest, pulling hard. The ice groaned, but held long enough for him to wrench her free. They collapsed together on the snow, his arms wrapped around her as if time itself were trying to pull her away again. The storm roared, then, abruptly, impossibly, quieted. The snowfall eased, thinning into a gentle drift. When Calder lifted his head, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, falling across the cabin door where Ellie's picture hung inside. Willow rested her head against his chest, her breathing evening out, her eyes softening in a way that felt like gratitude or recognition. The pup bounded toward them, circling in frantic relief. When Calder carried Willow back into the cabin, the light followed them like a benediction. He set her down near the stove just as someone knocked softly at the door. June Whitlow stood on the porch, tall, with long black braids trailing over a wool jacket lined with red flannel, her dark eyes warm and steady. June, a member of the Bitterroot Salish community, had once helped Calder patch a busted radiator on his truck. Since then, she'd stopped by occasionally with herbs for bruises or stories her grandmother used to tell about the ridge listening when a man's heart spoke true. Today, she looked at Calder, at Willow, at the pup, and then stepped inside without a word. She helped wrap Willow in blankets, her hands gentle and sure. When she finally looked up, her gaze met Calder's, and something quiet passed between them, something that didn't erase the past but softened the ground where future steps might fall. She reached out and took his hand. He didn't pull away. The storm had broken, outside and within, and in that hush, surrounded by the crackle of the stove and the soft breaths of the two dogs who had carried Ellie's last message to him, Calder felt something shift deep in his chest, a thaw long overdue, a reason to begin again. In the quiet of those mountains, Calder learned something that many of us forget until life forces us to remember it again. Healing does not always arrive as thunder or revelation. Sometimes it walks toward us on tired paws, wrapped in snow and silence, carrying the last message of someone we loved. Sometimes God whispers through the smallest miracles, a stray dog at the door, a glimmer of light breaking through a storm, a stranger who becomes a friend at exactly the right moment. Calder had spent years believing his story ended with loss, but the mountains showed him what Scripture has said all along, that grace often comes after the breaking, and that God restores the pieces we thought were gone forever. Not always in the way we expect, but always in the way we need. Maybe that is the lesson for all of us. No matter how cold the winter feels in our own lives, no matter how deep the silence becomes, there is a hand guiding us forward. There are new reasons to stand up again. There are second chances waiting on the porch if we are willing to open the door. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from and what part of the story stayed with you. And if you believe, as Calder learned to believe, that God still sends small miracles into our everyday lives, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next story. May God bless every one of you who listened today. May He watch over your home, your family, and the quiet places of your heart. And may you always find light after the storm.